So the United States Supreme Court has issued a massive emergency ruling completely overriding a lower court in a very, historic constitutional victory for state sovereignty, and here the Supreme Court completely struck down the lower court's defiance. In a high-stakes showdown over congressional redistricting, the High Court here officially granted an emergency application for a stay, instantly wiping out the lower court's injunction and restoring the exact election map that Republicans wanted in that state. But the real shockwave isn't just the stay that was issued by the court. The dynamic opinion actually by the Supreme Court kind of took the gloves off, directly criticizing the lower court judges for outright failing to follow recent Supreme Court precedent, ignoring the fundamental presumption of legislative good faith, and improperly interfering with the ongoing election cycle. With this new Supreme Court ruling, we have massive implications for the upcoming election, and also this issue is likely still going to move forward, but the state has won at least for now. So let's break down what exactly happened with this opinion from the Supreme Court, the brutal rebuke that came from the Supreme Court to the lower court, and also what happens now moving forward. Now, before we jump into what the Supreme Court just said with this order, if you like this type of content and you want to support it, make sure to like, subscribe, and also turn on all notifications. You can find those down below to make sure that you don't miss any of this information when I release it. Now, to understand how we reached this explosive breaking point in the Supreme Court, we have to look at how the lower court actually tried to test the Supreme Court's authority and also test the precedent that the Supreme Court just issued. This entire battle centers on the Supreme Court's landmark recent ruling in the case Louisiana versus Calais, and that ruling drastically reshaped how federal courts must evaluate vote dilution claims under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The High Court made it explicitly clear that lower court judges must separate race from politics, honor traditional districting principles, and stop treating a state's partisan layout as automatic evidence of discrimination. Following that ruling, the Supreme Court vacated the previous decision against Alabama and sent the case back down to the lower court with strict orders to apply that new Calais framework. But instead of falling in line with that Supreme Court ruling, the lower court here actually just outright rebelled. They issued a new ruling blocking Alabama's 2023 map, and they essentially forced the state to use a court-ordered special master map from previous election cycles. Alabama then immediately launched an emergency appeal straight back to the Supreme Court, and late in the night last week, the Supreme Court struck that back down. When the Supreme Court granted Alabama's emergency stay, they did not just pause that lower court ruling, they practically foretold the final outcome of this case. The conservative majority of the Supreme Court explicitly stated that Alabama has shown a high likelihood of success on the merits for both of its underlying constitutional claims. When the High Court here drops that type of language at this procedural posture, kind of on this emergency stay request, they are signaling exactly how they intend to rule on the final merits. The majority then systematically dismantled the lower court's legal errors. First, the Supreme Court ruled that the district court there flat out refused to honor the presumption of legislative good faith. The lower court judges had improperly treated Alabama's legal disagreement with prior court orders as proof of discriminatory intent. The majority of the Supreme Court reestablished that state legislators are constitutionally entitled to a presumption of good faith when drawing their maps. Second, the Supreme Court pointed out that the lower court judges completely botched the Calais test. Under the Supreme Court's decision in Calais, if challengers want to strike down a state map, their alternative map must perform just as well as the state's map across all legitimate objectives. The challengers failed to do that here according to the Supreme Court. They completely ignored Alabama's valid interest in preserving its historic Gulf Coast communities of interest and avoiding incumbent pairings. Furthermore, the Supreme Court slammed the lower court for violating one of the most vital principles of election law, that is the Purcell Doctrine. The court reiterated its long-standing rule that federal judges have no business altering election procedures on the eve of an ongoing election, which is outright ignored. The district court had tried to argue that keeping the court-drawn map in place was simply more convenient for election officials. The Supreme Court, however, completely rejected that logic. They actually added lines in here talking about state sovereignty, declaring that while federal courts must remain cautious about last-minute changes, sovereign states themselves are completely free to decide whether adjusting their own maps is in their own best interest and the interest of their own residents. Now, predictably, this emergency stay that was issued by the majority of the court was, opposed by dissenters on the Supreme Court, primarily the three liberal judges, so that liberal block of justices. Justice Sonia Sotomayor penned a lengthy, aggressive dissent, joined by Justice Kagan and then also Justice Jackson. They accused the conservative majority of the Supreme Court of injecting absolute chaos into the election cycle. The dissent argued that by restoring Alabama's 2023 map, the court is forcing election officials to reassign hundreds of thousands of voters on an incredibly short notice. Sotomayor went so far as to accuse Alabama of engaging in continuous gamemanship and resisting prior federal oversight, arguing that the state should not be rewarded with an emergency stay by the Supreme Court when the court-drawn master map had already been running smoothly in her eyes since 2024 during those elections and then also in the recent 2026 primaries. But regardless of the dissent's frustration, the immediate legal reality belongs entirely to the state of Alabama, because the Supreme Court has completely frozen the lower court's interference, and the state has officially been given a green light to move forward with the map that they want. Alabama is now aggressively going to move forward to implement the exact 2023 map that it wants, and they're going to do that for the upcoming congressional elections. State election officials are wasting no time right now. They are completely bypassing the lower court special master map, reestablishing the district configurations to protect certain communities of interest that they want. This is a massive shift in momentum going forward. The state is no longer playing defense against activist judges. They are actively dictating the rules of the battlefield because the highest court of the land, the Supreme Court, just backed up their plan, their map, and ruled in their favor in this case. Now that the map is securely back in the state's hands and implementation is underway, the case now kind of enters the final phase. Armed with kind of this massive emergency victory, the stay request that Alabama got, Alabama's legal team is likely preparing to file an official writ of cert to the Supreme Court because they need that to keep this stay order in place. This official Supreme Court writ will ask the justice to take up the full merits of the case using the Calais framework to lock in this stay and keep it in place permanently and also get a broader ruling in their favor to allow them to continue to move this way going forward for other elections. So the Supreme Court has drawn a definitive line in the sand, policing its own precedent and restoring power to the states. This is one of those situations where we did not see the Supreme Court sit on this very long. They moved on this very fast, especially because it deals with elections, but they were very quick to actually reaffirm their precedent and strike down what they believed was lower court defiance and gamemanship actually from the lower court, where the Supreme Court says that the lower court was simply just not following their precedent in that Calais decision. So as soon as Alabama officially files their writ of cert to the high court, I will bring that breakdown straight to you. If you want to help to push this video and support this channel, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, share this video. All of that helps to tell the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it spreads it out further. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.